In 1940, American intelligence started hearing rumors about a Japanese fighter that was cutting through Chinese planes with a kill ratio of 12-1. At first, it sounded impossible, since the reports described an aircraft that combined great speed, firepower, long range, and surprising agility all in one. Many Allied observers thought it had to be an exaggeration, because no fighter like that should exist. The truth, however, would turn out to be far more disturbing for Allied fighter pilots. This plane was the A6M Zero. It had been developed in the late 1930s as Japan pushed to dominate the Pacific, and its designer, Jiro Horikoshi of Mitsubishi, was told to create a fighter for the Imperial Japanese Navy that could fly over vast distances, operate from carriers, and still outmaneuver any opponent. By 1940, the Zero was faster than Britain's Spitfire or Germany's Messerschmitt Bf 109. It had a combat radius of about 1,900 miles, and it could land on the narrow rolling deck of a carrier at sea. For Japan, it was nothing short of the perfect aircraft to take on two powerful navies at once. The Zero's design showed how Japan valued agility and range more than protection. Its frame was made from a light aluminum alloy, and the whole aircraft weighed just under 2,000 kilograms. It carried a dependable but fairly light engine, and when that was combined with large wings and a slim body, the result was a fighter with superb agility. Its weapons were two 7.7mm machine guns in the cowling and two 20mm cannons in the wings, which was considered heavy firepower for a fighter in 1940. However, to get these qualities, some sacrifices had to be made. Since the aircraft also had to operate from carriers, its wingspan was limited to 12 meters. Nakajima, one of Japan's other major aircraft builders, decided these requirements were impossible and abandoned the project. Horikoshi pressed on though, and he used several advanced design features: thin elliptical wings that reduced drag, flush riveting that gave the surface a smooth finish, and an all-metal frame made possible by heat treatment methods learned from Germany. To save even more weight, holes were cut into some of the structural parts. The trade-offs were obvious. The Zero's skin was only about 1.2 millimeters thick at its strongest points, such as the forward fuselage and wing edges, and in places like the rear it was just half a millimeter. Other nations added armor around the engine, cockpit, and fuel tanks, but the Zero carried none of that, and it also lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single hit to the fuel system often meant the plane went up in flames. The cockpit itself was noticeably smaller than Western designs, shaped for the typically shorter Japanese pilot. Every detail showed the same doctrine at work. Japan wanted a light, long-range fighter, flown by pilots trained to avoid being hit, rather than one built to survive damage. And while this worked brilliantly at first, it would also set the stage for the Zero's eventual downfall. Because its outer skin was so thin, a pilot could dent it just by stepping onto the wrong spot. To solve this, the designers added special footholds and handles that stayed hidden inside the fuselage. Before climbing in, the pilot pressed a button to pop them out, used them to board, and then they folded back in so the surface stayed smooth. Another clever feature was a set of concealed flotation bags. These were tucked into the fuselage and could be filled with air taken from the engine intake, which gave the aircraft a chance to stay afloat if it went down at sea. Nothing in these details suggested a throwaway weapon, yet within a few short years, that's exactly how the Zero would often be used. Japanese pilots called it the Risen, or simply Zero, after the imperial year 2600, which matched 1940, the year it entered service. When the Zero appeared in real numbers during 1940 and 1941, Allied observers could no longer dismiss it as rumor. It stood as proof of Japan's sudden rise to dominance in the skies, and the Allies were about to find out in the most brutal way what that dominance meant. Now the thing is, the Zero's true potential was unlocked in the hands of its pilots, and at first these were no ordinary men. And so, before we get to the story of the Zero's first combat victories, we need to take a look at them. Japanese doctrine held that a fighter was only as good as the men who flew it. And in the early years of the war, those men were among the best in the world. Actually, you could freely say they were the best in the world. Japanese naval aviation prioritized quality over quantity, so the Imperial Japanese Navy ran a cadet program that was brutal and highly selective. Some years, only about 100 young men made it through. The standards were horrific, but the result was a small core of pilots who had the skill and discipline to handle an aircraft whose only real protection was speed and maneuverability. There was no room for error. That logic worked, at least in the beginning, because the Japanese aviators could get the most out of the Zero's agility, range, and firepower. In the first months of the Pacific War, this combination of aircraft and pilot was devastating, and it was right at the peak of that early superiority, with both the pilots and their aircraft at their strongest, that the Zero drew its first blood in combat. In July 1940, Chinese forces were still flying mostly old biplanes and early monoplanes such as the Soviet-built Polikarpovs, and many of these were poorly maintained and often flown by undertrained pilots. So, unsurprisingly, the Zero cut through them with ease, shooting down everything in its path. However, the real shock to the world that didn't believe Chinese reports was now about to come, as the Allies would meet the Zero for the first time in the opening strike of the Pacific War. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carriers launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, with the goal to cripple the US Pacific Fleet, cement Japan's control of the region, and discourage American interference in Asia. However, the attack brought the United States into the war that same day. During the Pearl Harbor raid, the Zero flew as escort for the bombers, keeping watch over them as they struck at battleships and airfields. America did have fighters on the islands, mostly P-40 Warhawks and P-36 Hawks, with only a few Wildcats. Just a handful managed to get airborne in time. Those pilots fought hard, and men like George Welch and Kenneth Taylor in their P-40 even shot down several Japanese aircraft, but they were heavily outnumbered. On paper, the Warhawks were faster at top speed than the Zero, but they simply couldn't come close to its maneuverability or the skill of the Japanese pilots. In the months that followed, Japanese naval air power rolled across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and the Zero was at the center of it all. In April 1942, during the Indian Ocean raid, Japanese carriers struck British bases at today's Sri Lanka. They never caught the main British fleet, but their attacks still caused serious losses. Zeros clashed with Hawker Hurricanes, and time after time managed to outturn them in dogfights. Allied pilots learned quickly to fear the aircraft, because in those early months the Zero just seemed like it couldn't be touched. From Pearl Harbor through the campaigns of early 1942, the Zero was the dominant naval fighter of the Pacific, and for a while, it truly ruled the skies. Yet that rule wouldn't last forever. By the summer and fall of 1942, during the Guadalcanal campaign, American pilots had worked out new tactics that started to level the odds. Even the F-4F Wildcat, which was realistically outdated at this point, could hold its ground when flown with discipline. The myth of the invincible Zero was beginning to break apart, but not before hundreds of Allied aircraft were shot down by it. However, what happened at Guadalcanal was only the beginning, because the Allies were about to turn the Zero's strengths into its greatest weaknesses. During the Aleutian Islands campaign, a Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga took off from a carrier to raid Dutch Harbor in Alaska. His Zero was damaged by ground fire that cut an oil line, and he tried to make an emergency landing on Akutan Island, which had been chosen as a pickup site for downed airmen. But the ground there was a soft bog, and when Koga touched down, the landing gear dug in, the Zero flipped onto its back, and Koga was killed instantly. The aircraft, though, remained largely intact. For weeks, it sat there untouched until an American patrol plane spotted the wreck. Recovery teams hauled the crashed fighter out, then shipped it back to San Diego. There, engineers and mechanics carefully restored it to flight condition, and they now had a goldmine of information on the Zero's strengths and weaknesses, which was soon to be used against it. When American test pilots flew the captured Zero, they saw that at high speeds, the ailerons stiffened, and rolling and diving became unstable since the pilot didn't have hydraulic assistance for controls. It rolled more easily to the left than to the right, which made its movements predictable in combat. The second weakness was its fragility. With such thin skin, no armor for the pilot, and no self-sealing fuel tanks, even a short burst of fire could set the plane ablaze. The third was its carburetor. The Zero used a float-type carburetor, which meant that during zero-gravity maneuvers the engine could flood and stall. Early British Spitfires had suffered from the same flaw, but theirs had been corrected, while the Japanese never made that upgrade. All of these findings went straight into Allied training manuals, and now pilots finally had clear and practical rules for how to fight the Zero. They were instructed never to try to turn with a Zero at low speeds, because that was its biggest advantage. Instead, they were told to use speed, altitude, and diving attacks, the so-called boom and zoom tactics, where the Zero couldn't follow Allied fighters. With this knowledge, even the rugged but less nimble Wildcat could survive. But this was just the beginning of the end for the Zero, because the data from the captured Zero was passed directly to Grumman, where engineers were finishing the F-6F Hellcat. The final touches were designed with the Zero's weaknesses in mind, and the Hellcat was now eager for its first combat. But even before this stroke of luck with the captured Zero or the arrival of new American fighters, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch had already been working on an answer. Reading early reports that described a Japanese fighter with unmatched maneuverability, he knew his F-4F Wildcat squadron would not survive long if they tried to fight on the enemy's terms. At his kitchen table, using nothing more than a few matchsticks, Thatch sketched out a formation that might give his slower, heavier Wildcats a chance. The next day, he tested it in the air. The idea was straightforward. Two fighters would fly together, and if one was chased, both would turn toward each other. The Zero locked onto the first aircraft would suddenly find itself flying straight into the guns of the wingman. Simple as it was, the tactic worked, and it quickly became known as the Thatch Weave. It was tested in combat at the Battle of Midway in June 1942 and later over Guadalcanal. The maneuver gave American pilots one of their first reliable counters to the Zero, and it remains a valid tactic even today. Midway itself proved decisive. The Japanese carrier force was crippled, and with it the aura of invincibility surrounding the Zero began to fade. Meanwhile, things were getting worse for the Zero's pilots. By early 1943, new Allied fighters were arriving in the Pacific in large numbers. The P-38 Lightning brought range and firepower. The Corsair was fast and rugged, and above all came the F-6F Hellcat, designed to beat the Zero in almost every way. When the Hellcat entered combat, the balance shifted sharply. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, US pilots destroyed Japanese aircraft in such numbers that the battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese losses were catastrophic, and with each month the gap only widened. Yet even in decline, the Zero could still be dangerous. No Allied aircraft could match its turning ability at low speed, and overconfidence was sometimes costly. A skilled Japanese veteran could still punish a careless opponent. But with discipline, tactics, and modern aircraft, the Allies had the upper hand. Japan had entered the war hoping for a short conflict that would force America to negotiate. Instead, it found itself trapped in a long war of attrition it could not win. Requests for a successor to the Zero had gone out as early as 1940, but development was slow. The A7M Repu, finally flown in May 1944, was exactly the kind of fighter Japan's aviators needed, fast and heavily armed, but only 9 were built. Other projects, like the Shiden and the Raiden, spread Japan's limited resources thin, and while the Allies focused on a few effective types and mass production, Japan tried to develop more than 90 major designs. However, none could change the outcome. By 1944, the tide had fully turned. The Zero, once the miracle of the Pacific, was now outmatched and outproduced. But still, the worst part was yet to come. Japan's pilots, who were once the pride of the Navy, were being lost much faster than they could be replaced. As the war dragged on, Japan's pilot training outright collapsed. Fuel shortages, limited facilities, and constant losses meant that by late 1944, some naval pilots entered combat with as little as 40 flight hours. Their American counterparts averaged 500. The United States was turning tens of thousands of well-educated young men into trained aviators every year, while Japan was producing only a few thousand, and to a much lower standard. Elite veterans were by this point almost all dead, and they were being replaced by inexperienced recruits in aging fighters. For an aircraft that depended on skill to survive without armor, this was disastrous. Because of all this, Japan turned to a desperate tactic that became infamous as kamikaze. Yes, they could damage and even sink some ships, but most of them were shot down long before they could do anything, and they burned through what little remained of Japan's air strength. The final proof came in August 1945. The B-29 bombers that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew without escort. There was no resistance left in the air. In that moment, the Zero story ended. It had come full circle, first as the symbol of Japan's rising power in the Pacific, and at the end as the emblem of an empire crumbling in defeat.